Thank you, Friedrich. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Friedrich already mentioned, my name is Mariana Rezende. I'm a local from Brazil. I'm finishing up now, by the end of the month, my project. And I'm here because I really believe with blood, bones, and brains that people have to have their human rights respected. And when that does not happen, they have to have access to remedies. So now I'm going to talk today and give some questions and offer some insights, of course. It's almost the end of the fellowship, something I already figured out, about what to do when human rights are not respected, and especially more focused on what to do when human rights, the harms come by actions of companies, right? First, some cases or some stories or real life. Let's suppose you are a garment worker in the global south. You work for a factory that manufactures items, apparel for European brands, several of them. And recently, because of contract changes, because of deadline changes, because of cancellations, you have had to work longer hours without being paid for the overtime. And even so, more recently, you were even informed that you're not going to get paid what you initially agreed because one of the brands canceled a contract and is not going to pay the items that have already been produced. You talk to your local management. He says they say they can't do anything about it. Their hands are tied. Or maybe you are someone whose family's subsistence requires or depends on the work you do in harvesting seasonally vegetables. It happens. Vegetables or fruits in the south of Europe, and each year you come back, the working conditions become worse and worse. Lately, for example, your current employer withheld your passport. You don't even know if your contract is registered. You don't even know if you're getting paid what you're supposed to be paid because you don't have access to this information. Because you're an immigrant, you're afraid to go to the public authorities, so you don't, and you, for obvious reasons, also don't trust your local management, and you really don't have anywhere to go from here. Or maybe you live in a community where the water supply has been affected by the extractivist operation of a multinational nearby, or you are an NGO that has identified that kids are being coerced to work under stressful and dangerous conditions. Well, the cases are multiple. How can we ensure that victims of human rights harms caused by companies have access to remedy? A little spoiler, I will develop that further, but we have to use all the available channels. We have to build new ones, and we have to strengthen the ones that are already at our disposal. Of course, that presents many challenges. Just as I was mentioning to you earlier, like with the examples, with the stories, these are not the stories I shared. This is not like a specific case. This happens every day throughout the world, and I think it's important also to understand that people are affected differently. They're affected here in Europe. For example, I love the story detailed that you don't have forced labor here, or that if you buy tomatoes from Brandenburg, I live in Berlin, it's less worse because you don't have any problems. When you go to logistics, there are multiple cases of the drivers being hired in contracts in Eastern Europe where they make 600 euros, and in Germany, well, you can make much with that. You really can't make a living, where they have no place to sleep, they have no access to social security or health insurance. Well, it's everywhere, and that's why companies have to be responsible for their own area of business and throughout their supply chains. And when you go to supply chains or value chains and different levels of suppliers, you have, of course, the different languages and cultures. You have the lack of legal instruments or mandatory provisions regarding the human rights and business nexus that's something that is still being developed. The lack of awareness about rights, not ever this the idea of rights, of human rights, is something somewhat from the Western perspective, and sometimes that's not the wording that people will use, and there's a need to raise awareness about what you can claim. You have also distrust in institutions. If you are in a situation of vulnerability, you might not want to look or go to someone who would be responsible for taking care of your rights. The high cost and access to justice, I'm thinking here the judiciary system, and also challenges in accessing foreign justice systems. Because when we talk foreign value chains, we're talking about countries and about a globalized economy that spreads throughout the world, right? So in legal systems, domestic legal systems, it's not always easy or given that you can access or you can sue a company, you can claim remedy if you live in another country, if you're not a citizen. There are several difficulties in that process. As companies become more and more powerful, nowadays, of course, we have several companies who have more revenue than some countries. These challenges become more important, more prevalent, and that's why in 2011, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were approved. These are the international standards, like the basic go-to to start this conversation, and it's based on 3 pillars. So we have the state duty to protect. The state is the main responsible for ensuring that human rights are protected, right? But also have the corporate duty to respect these human rights. And when harm occurs, you have remedy. The victims have to have access to effective remedy. And this is what I'm focusing on, because even though the other 2 pillars, they have been more well developed, the access to remedy is always more challenging, because what does a remedy look like? What are the possibilities for victims? And of course, someone has to pay for it. Is that contract in a contract? If there is no law for it to do it, it kind of depends on if they want to do or not. In that regard, then, what is a grievance mechanism? A grievance mechanism, it's, I guess we use the name because it's what is used, the UNGPs, of course, and the grievance mechanism is a routinized process to receive, investigate, address, and document a human rights violation, a human rights harm. So it's a process, right? A grievance mechanism in the UNGPs, they are regarded as any channel that you have for that. They can be state-based, even the judiciary can be considered as a grievance mechanism if you're talking about broadly. However, in the day-to-day, when you talk about grievance mechanism, it's usually you're talking about the mechanisms they are held within a company as a listening channel through which people can reach out to the company and tell them, hey, this situation happened. In any of the cases that I mentioned earlier, for example, having the possibility of reaching out to the supermarket that buys the tomatoes that you're harvesting and letting them know that the situation, that the worker rights are not being respected. They can take many forms, of course. They can be online, they can be offline, they can be paper-based, they can be a contact point, they can be, well, really, you can choose, they can be a hotline. And actually, the idea is that they take different shapes because each group, each target group will need has different needs. And the reason here is exactly to avoid that a grievance mechanism exists, but it's stronger in design than in operation. That people can really reach it, that they don't trust it, that it's not legitimate. So it makes sense to have different kinds of channels. And what about Germany? What about the fellowship? What? Das Lieferketten- und Sorgfaltspflichtgesetz. Several words. Or LKSG, I guess, yeah. So the whole word means the duty of diligence for supply chains. which is a law that was approved, that actually came to force in Germany in January this year, 2023. And as a part of this law, companies are mandated, now it's a legal obligation that they establish these grievance mechanisms. In its section 8, the law then establishes that companies have to have a channel through which they can receive information about risks or actual violations that occurred in their own area of business, that of their direct suppliers or indirect suppliers. When you bring that to reality, it's immense. It's really challenging to bring that, to unfold that obligation throughout the world. And for example, questions that sometimes you don't even think about it. Brazil, for example, it's a country where access to WhatsApp or some online technologies is a bit more widespread, but it's not the case for everywhere. So you need to have different sources, different channels to access this, right? So in the law, and that's just a curiosity actually, because they use, the translation goes through complaints system or complaints mechanism, but here is the same idea. It's a channel, it's a process through which the companies can deal with these complaints, can deal with this situation. And it also, there is a business case for this. It's an early warning system. Instead of learning through the papers, instead of having a lawsuit, you have the opportunity as a responsible business to deal with that straight up. A problem has arrived, human rights harm is, or a person is at risk, you have the opportunity to do that earlier, before it actually becomes a harm. That's the idea behind having this kind of channels. And my question here is, how are German companies adapting to this new legal requirement? Well, I have, this is the question that I tried to answer, which brought me here, which is my project. And I was particularly interested in that because I was working as a case handler in Brazil. So I worked in a grievance mechanism back home, and it's hard. It's very hard. I worked basically as a mediator, and I was there directly. I interacted with the affected people. I saw their faces. I listened to the stories. I was a direct line to the representatives of the company. There was a structure. There was a public oversight. Although there is no specific law for it in Brazil, it was based on the other laws that were already in place that allowed for that. And it's very hard to reach remedy. It's very hard because of the different shapes it can take, because people are not always satisfied, as they don't have to be, right? It's not mandatory that because there is a mechanism, you have to be thankful. Not at all, right? But knowing how hard it is to access and to provide some sense of justice when you're there, where it happened, I was very interested to see how German companies would deal with that challenge, since they have to go all the way to the indirect suppliers, right? And I have had the opportunity. My host institution is Groningen, Human Rights and Responsible Business. It's a consultancy firm focused in human rights, in implementing human rights strategies for businesses. I'm based also in Berlin. And I had the opportunity then throughout this year to work directly with business who were doing that. Who were adapting what they already had in place. They were establishing, they were creating governance, they were establishing the governance, they were creating the rules of procedure, they were discussing internally if this is compliance, if this is CSR, if this is sustainability, who will deal with that. And some of the main challenges that we have been dealing with, that I found, is of course there is a tendency to go to checkbox solutions. There are some service providers, you can just like put an online mask hidden in a website in German, which is not at all something that is accessible. But you also have a lack of knowledge on how to deal with complaints and what it means to deal with human rights complaints. It's different, and you're not always going to have someone in your organization who can deal with sexual harassment cases, child labor cases, Just as, especially if you're relying, for example, in a compliance space, which usually goes like to corruption or other cases where we work more with documents or, well, there's all these differences, right? And so we are at a step that companies, some of them had already to have something established in January, so they're going after it, they're working on it, they're writing their human rights policies, they're making the rules of procedure available, and they're crossing the fingers so that no complaint comes in. Because they have no idea what to do if a complaint comes in. If you ask them, okay, it's online, you got a complaint, who will receive it? Who you're gonna refer it to? Like, who is your investigative team? What are your resources? Really, it's a silence, and no one really wants to deal with that because it's called grievances, it's complaints. No one wants to deal with that. It has this idea that it has something to get rid of and just move on with our day. And while we remain with that idea, of course, they will not be effective, they will not be legitimate, they will not be trusted by the users, which means they will not work, basically, right? Not for the companies, not for the business case, and not for the people. The idea of the UNGPs here and the idea of the business human rights nexus in general is that the rights holders on center. When you're talking about due diligence, usually if you're talking on a corporate level, you're talking about risks for the company. This is not the case here. The risks are for the people. And so you have to change that idea. And so, considering all of that, all the opportunities that I have to deal directly in companies, with companies, people who are really trying their best to do with what they have at hand, they're not experts in it. It's new, it's a new law. Companies are adapting, the professionals are learning, so it's part of the process. And because of that, I've been working, and this is my final report. If you follow me on my LinkedIn, you'll be able to access it. Which is basically FAQ, right? With the most common questions that we have from people who are responsible for implementing that, to make it as efficient as possible, as legitimate as possible, as centered on rights holders as possible, which actually engages with rights holders in the process of designing it, in the process of dealing with the complaint, and all of these intricacies that really required a lot of planning, which is not actually something the Germans, in my experience, do very well. So they have the ability to thrive here. And with that, and the whole idea with also like with the impact of the fellowship and with all this information is to be able to support those who are actually striving to make this another venue, to make available another venue through which people can actually have their rights respected. In the end of the day, it's all about getting people's rights respected. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariana, for sharing your research and your engagement on grievance mechanisms and human rights impacts.